She was my first love.
When Mark Athens loses the mother of his children, it leaves a gaping hole in his life.
To fall in love again and feel that for another person was something that I longed for.
When he meets a woman who seems to fill the void,
Charity drew me in personality-wise.
he'll quickly discover he's just the Mark she's been looking for.
She's a master manipulator, and she's literally out to take all that she can.
I paid for vehicles, for apartments, cell phones, clothes.
That's strange. Why are there men's clothes here if her daughter's here?
That's when Dakota started looking into Charity's background. There wasn't a Charity Parcham or a charity or anything.
Montgomery County has ordered Athens to pay $96,000 by tomorrow.
I found Charity's husband, her real husband. Boy, did I get a kick in the balls. My name is Mark Athens. I live in Willis, Texas, and I'm a surgical first assistant licensed through the state of Texas. I've been doing this for 35 years, and I love it. I'm proud of all three of my boys. I couldn't have asked for better. Dakota is my youngest. He is 25. He is God's gift to me. Dakota is very high functioning, but he is autistic. So he sees things in a different light. He is purely honest and open with what he sees, understands, or hears.
I do love my dad. My dad's a very wonderful guy. He takes care of me, takes care of my doctor's appointments, hair appointments, that sort of stuff. Always stands up for me.
We were told that he would never graduate high school. He graduated from high school. He went on to college. It's a tragedy that his mother is deceased and has not seen the young man that he's turned out to be. Kelly was my first love. I spent 22 years of my life with a woman that I love dearly. I feel the void in my heart was something that I longed for.
It's been almost 4 years since the death of Mark's first wife.
I'd tried dating and there wasn't any encounters that were serious. I was hoping to find someone who I could trust enough that if something happens to me, that they can carry on forward to help Dakota so he's not left alone, because I'm not going to be around forever. I met Charity online. Charity said she was a Texas registered nurse. It was a couple of home health agencies. She worked with elderly patients and terminally ill patients. That made me say, wow, she's got to be pretty special if she can do that. We did have a chance to have a date, going to a local restaurant. Charity had told me that she had been married twice and that she had 4 daughters.
Charity is living with her 2 youngest daughters, Paige, 17, and Destiny, 15, in the nearby town of Spring.
She had been divorced from her second husband for almost 10 years. Charity had told me that his name was Bart Parcham, that she didn't have anything to do with Bart, that he was a convicted felon. I said, okay, well, it is what it is. Charity had a magnetism that drew me in personality-wise that in a way kind of reminded me of the boy's mom. Bubbly, friendly.
It only takes a few weeks for Mark to fall in love. Now he introduces Charity to his closest friends, his neighbors, Gina and James, who are living with him while their house is being renovated.
Mark said, hey, I'd like you guys to meet her, see what you think. So I was like, oh, yay, that's so nice. She was very bubbly and I liked her.
She looked very normal to me. Just a normal, average person. Like, nice.
Mark and Charity start seeing more of one another.
I mean, to fall in love again and feel that for another person, that was something that I hadn't felt in a long time.
Charity came, she was like, hey, I've got to run a few errands. Do you want to come with me? I just have to pick up a prescription and we'll come back. So we go to the pharmacy and she immediately pulls out her insurance card and it said, Charity Parcham, Bart Parcham. And I thought, who's Bart Parcham? And she said, that's my ex.
Charity has been divorced for almost 10 years. It seems strange her ex is still on her insurance card.
But, you know, she started immediately talking to the pharmacist, and so I wasn't able to talk more about it. So then we leave the pharmacy, and she says, hey, I'm really sorry, but I need to stop by my house. When we get there, she says, my middle daughter, Paige, lives here by herself. Then she goes, oh, I'm gonna go to my bedroom. Come with me, you can see the bedroom. So I go to the bedroom, and there's a closet open full of men's clothes. And so I'm thinking, what? That's strange. Why are there men's clothes here if her daughter's here? And then I look down and there's a basket of like laundry, like someone's staying here. And then she takes me through the bathroom and there's like men's cologne, men's razors, shaving cream. And I said, what man lives here? And she says, oh, no man lives here. My ex comes here after working out, showers and changes, and then takes the girls to do stuff. And I was like, okay, but this is a lot of stuff. It literally looked like the girls lived there and he lived there. So when we got back, I went straight to Mark. I was like, okay, I don't understand at all. You may want to discuss that with her.
That was where my confusion starts. How do I take this? Because I was in love with Charity, and because of I wanted things to work, that was the whole intent, was to get a life partner.
And he comes to us and mentions, hey, I've asked Charity to move in with us. And James and I, you know, are like, okay.
Her youngest daughter, Destiny, came with Charity. So I picked up a ready-made family, pretty much.
Charity really took over the house. Like, these are my things and I'm gonna cook this. And I thought, she just wants us out of here.
Charity wanted to quit work and just concentrate on Destiny and Dakota. At that point in time, I just said, you know what? Sure, let's rock and roll with this. I'm getting back on track with a life, a family life.
I just didn't understand it. You know, we're thinking, he's just so in love. You know, is this what's happening? We didn't like it at all. Honestly,
I thought that Gina and James were not getting along with Charity because there might be an issue that I'm not seeing. So that weekend, I wanted to go somewhere with James, Gina, and Charity, and I could take a little mental health break and, I guess, reconnect.
James and I were a bit reluctant, but we were like, okay, you know, we'll do it.
Charity starts drinking. All of a sudden, she starts forcing me to do these shots. Then I just put my foot down and said, that's it, I'm not doing no more shots.
James snaps a picture of us at the table, and it was, oh, I got a picture of us, I'm posting it on Facebook, and we're like, oh, cute.
Moments after posting the photo, James gets a phone call from an old and trusted friend, Michael Flores. Michael and Charity had been friends and colleagues in the past, but it didn't end well.
I was just like, wow, out of all the people in the world, what are the odds? It had been 2 years since I'd saw Charity. She was more full-figured than she was when I knew her, but I knew it was her as soon as I saw her.
James comes back to the table and he's very, like, freaked out looking. And then James kind of like nudges me while Mark and Charity are talking about something. And he says, Mike Flores says, Mark needs to run from Charity. James asks Charity, "Do you know Mike Flores?" And her face was shock. And then James goes, "I grew up with him. And in fact, I spoke to him and he didn't have very good things to say about you."
But before Charity can respond, the group is distracted by another bar patron.
Somebody bumps into Charity's chair, which, seemed harmless. Oh, and he was like, "Oh, sorry," and just walked off. But then she's telling Mark, "Oh my gosh, I think he touched me." And now Mark's up and he's like, "What do you mean? Like, how did he touch you?" And she seems to be getting Mark all riled up. There he is, pointing him out.
Man, I was fixing to go at it. I was losing my cool. My saving grace was James decided, this is done, we got to walk out of here now. We got out in the truck.
Charity is still, badgering Mark. They're fighting. Mark's trying to get her to calm down, and she seems to just want to escalate it. And she's like, "You don't even care."
When we were coming down the road here at the house, Charity got out of the truck.
She slams the door, walks over to her vehicle and says, "I'm leaving." And Mark's like, "What?"
And she did, she left.
James and I look at each other and we're thinking, but where is she going? This is not good.
I told James that she isn't who he thinks she is. She's a master manipulator.
I lost everything. I lost everything. She is the spawn of Satan.
Mark Athens' evening out with his friends and girlfriend has ended in confusion.
I'm going like, what the hell just happened?
Charity just tears out of there. And I don't even understand.
James thinks he knows what was behind Charity's hasty retreat.
James says she didn't want to deal with any of the Mike Flores questions from any of us. So it was a giant blown up situation to create drama. And then I think, oh, that's right.
The next morning, there's still no sign of Charity. It's James's chance to get Mark alone.
They sit down and James begins to just unload all this material that Mike Flores, explained to him.
I gave him a rundown of my dealings with her. I met her at the tattoo shop years ago. Charity liked getting older guys to fall for her and then getting what she wanted out of them, whether it was dinner or jewelry or, taking care of some of her bills. Charity just uses, sexual favors to kind of reel them in. She talked about how to manipulate men to get what she wanted out of it. Weak men with money who are searching for a relationship. Use them while she can and just go on to the next. She's a master manipulator. She's sweet on the outside and just a monster on the inside once she gets her fangs sunk in. I told James to tell Mark to get out now while you can before this guy just loses everything. This is the real deal, and she's literally out to take all that she can.
A dire warning, which Mark completely ignores when Charity returns a day later.
James said Mark's response was, "Well, that may have been her in her past. That's not the way she is now."
You know what? I had lost somebody that I spent 22 years of my life with. To feel that for another person, I opened up totally, 100%.
And now, Gina and James are the ones who feel unwelcome.
There's a lot of tension in the house. You go in to get a cup of coffee. If she's in there, she just immediately removes herself from the room. I'm sure she doesn't want me asking her questions.
I'm getting told over and over that they're just using you. Charity had told me that James had tried to sell her drugs. She had told me also that James had tried to come on to her on multiple occasions. I was upset, of course.
Honestly, I was really hurt by it. He must be believing this stuff. And at that point, James and I were like, we need to immediately get out of Mark's house. We get everything done quick, and we move where we needed to be next door. It was weird. We lived right next door to Mark, but we didn't talk.
Everything really started going into high gear within a matter of weeks. I got down on one knee and asked Charity if she would marry me. And I guess I'm expecting something that, okay, yeah, and then come give me a big hug and a kiss and oh my gosh, but it's subdued. She looked at me and she said yes, she would. I guess I'm thinking of a crescendo when it was more like a little vibrato, But that's the way that occurred. And she told me she didn't want any of her family knowing. Nobody. Daughters, nobody. Charity had pushed it, wanting to get married in South Dakota at Sturgis. So we went to South Dakota. We got married in City Hall in front of pictures of all the mayors of Deadwood, South Dakota. We go back. The people at the resort that we stayed at had drinks for us there, and that was it. That was the end of the night. What a wedding night, huh? Nothing else happened. Actually, nothing else happened for the next 6 days. So for 6 days, we didn't consummate the marriage? Seriously? What the hell is going on? On the way back, I had 20-something hours of driving to think, and the whole time back, I felt like I'd made one hell of an error.
Once back home in Willis, Mark sets his concerns aside and commits himself to supporting his new family. But it's a strain.
The expenses increased tenfold from the day we were married. Charity told me that Bart didn't pay any child support. He was an ex-con deadbeat dad. That's exactly the way she put it. With Charity and her daughters, I had to pay for vehicles, I had to pay for furniture, I had to pay for apartments, I had to pay for college tuitions, cell phones, and I'm doing it all alone for a lot of people, even though Destiny was the only daughter that lived here. One day, Charity said she had to go see Paige and pick up some things that she had. She left at like 8, 9 in the morning. I would come home from work about 4 or 5-ish in the afternoon. She wasn't here. I was going like, okay, well, she's just busy. I'd text her and couldn't get a reply out of the text. She just disappeared off the face of the earth. Gone. She came back home at about 11 o'clock. And she's going like, well, I had a lot of things I had to get with Paige. I had suspicions that something was up. And that's when Dakota started looking into Charity's background.
Actually, I went through online, found some stuff about her. I went through the Victoria County, Texas Odyssey database. That's actually the court docket system, and she has a criminal record for a theft by check. She said she was a nurse.
All the lights, all the red flags popped up. You can't be a nurse with a criminal record. You just can't do it. I called the Texas State Nursing Board. They went and looked. There wasn't a Charity Parcham or a Charity or anything with her birthday in there. Anything, her social security, anything. I'm going like, Are you kidding me? So she's been lying to me all this time about her being a nurse when she never was.
What else is she lying about? Now Mark really wants to know what Charity has been up to.
And then I also remembered that I put GPS trackers on my vehicles, on all the vehicles. So if one of them ever got stolen, I knew exactly where that would be. I said, you know what? I need to look and see where the vehicles are. And guess where the vehicles would be showing up at, especially the one that Charity had. At the old house in Spring.
Where earlier, Gina had observed men's toiletries and clothes.
Imagine that.
Mark Athens has just discovered that his new bride, Charity, has been spending a lot of time at her previous house.
Of course, I'd already had the devil picking on my shoulder, causing doubt. And doubt was starting to seed pretty hard and heavy then.
True, her daughter Paige lives there, but does her ex-husband Bart live there as well? Mark's suspicions are growing.
There's a lot of things I'll believe, but when it comes down to it and you can't get in touch with somebody, whether you needed them for an emergency or nothing, no contact, cell phones turned off, things changed very rapidly then. I started looking at Charity's cell phone records because the phones were in my name. And it was kind of funny because the morning that she disappeared off the face of the earth, there was a phone call made on her cell phone, and guess whose phone it went to? Bart Parcham's. I confronted Charity about this. I said, you're calling your ex-husband 3 or 4 times a day. It had to do about the girls. They are his daughters. I said, so you're telling me that you've sent him over 100 and something texts about his daughters when you never did that before. She blew up. So she got extremely mad, extremely ticked off. What are you doing tracking me? You don't trust me? And I told her straight up, hell no, I don't trust you. You're doing things that are violating that trust. I asked her if she was sleeping with Bart, and she said no, she was not. But sometimes you don't have to have an admission of guilt whenever you got the proof sitting right in front of your face. She was pissed off and she just took off. After about 10 hours, Charity came back and it was like, let's talk. I can fix this, I can do right. I went and said, okay, you can't say I'm not gonna try.
Charity seems determined to make a fresh new start with Mark.
Charity made reservations at the San Luis Hotel in Galveston for the weekend. Just me and her. Something to rebuild what had been broken. We go to the hotel. The restaurant was a very good dinner, but halfway through the meal, she wanted to go back upstairs. We went back up to the room, and she starts getting a little bit frisky with me. And we end up having sex twice. So I'm going like, okay. We go out for a walk on the beach together. The next morning we get up and go have some fancy brunch there that they have every Sunday. I opened up totally, 100%.
And Charity is in it 100% too. For Dakota's birthday, she organizes a trip they can all 3 enjoy together.
Dakota wanted to go to Fredericksburg. Me and Dakota spent lots of time at Fredericksburg. We always have.
Charity arranges for her daughters to house sit, and the 3 of them head west to Fredericksburg, a popular spot for wine lovers and history buffs.
It's a 4 to 5 hour drive there. Got there in Fredericksburg with the B&B, and then Charity started a conversation that went really south on me, real quick. Charity's talking about her past life, about how one of her boyfriends had made her be a drug mule down in Mexico and do some real wild, crazy stuff. And Dakota's out there with us. So I got uptight. And this is not something that Dakota needed to be hearing, and he doesn't know what to think. I'm sure right now he's in panic mode. And you can tell because With anybody that's autistic, they start flapping their hands. I would think she was trying to bait me into something to where it would get physical, and then she could have me arrested for assault. So it's a he said, she said type situation, because that's exactly what she wanted. She was baiting me into that. I said, I've got to get this under control immediately and isolate this for me and Dakota. And I did. I just said, it stops now. This is not the life I'm gonna lead. I said, Dakota, we gotta go home.
Mark and Dakota make the 5-hour drive home, knowing that when they get there, they'll have to tell Destiny and Paige they left their mom in Fredericksburg to cool down. But that's not how the night unfolds.
Dakota and I pulled in around 4 in the morning. The dogs were gone, and Destiny and Paige were gone, and so were the vehicles. The Mustang, her truck, the truck that I had, all of those vehicles were gone. And I knew what had happened then. I'd been set up. Me and Dakota walk into my house and see a lot of things missing. I mean, a lot of things.
It was very empty, so I was like, where's the stuff that was gone?
My phone starts burning up.
It's a string of texts that were sent by Mark's neighbor, James, while he and Dakota were still on their way home.
You're out in the hill country of Texas. They don't get cell signals down there. So I got them after I got here.
Hours earlier, sometime around midnight, Gina and James had been alerted to trouble.
Champ keeps barking. Champ likes Mark and he likes to watch his house. And James goes outside and he sees a U-Haul truck and a Charger, and there's a man and some girls there.
Gina believes she recognizes the man and at least one of the girls.
The lights were on so you could see Bart and Paige.
Bart Parcham, Charity's ex.
They were going into the house, bringing things out and putting them into the U-Haul. And at this point, James and I are just thinking, this is not good. We were like, this is not good. James says, I don't see Mark's truck. Let me just send him a quick text.
But by the time Mark receives James' messages, it's far too late.
It was 4 in the morning. I've driven 800 miles. I'm mentally and physically wiped out. So me and Dakota lay down and went to sleep.
Mark feels he's been burgled, but as his spouse, Charity is entitled to remove her belongings. What happens next is less of a legal gray area.
The next morning, I woke up and my phone is going crazy. I'm getting alerts from my bank, sending me notices of charges right and left. They're wanting to know what's going on. There was $15,000 taken out of my bank account, all to Amazon. And Amazon told me where everything was going, to Spring. Guess who lives in Spring?
Sure, Charity's daughter Paige lives there, but now Mark thinks Gina was right, that Bart Parcham is also staying there.
I knew what had happened. I knew who did it. In the meantime, Charity is texting me, burning my phone up, trying to get me to come pick her up from Fredericksburg. First thing that popped into my head is Charity was not even in Fredericksburg.
Mark has his suspicions. Now he goes looking for proof.
I went to Sam's and actually said, I want to see who used my card, and they pulled it up on their video surveillance. And who was on the video surveillance? Charity and Bart. When she's trying to get me to go back to Fredericksburg to pick her up, her and Bart are here in the Woodlands at Sam's trying to pick up stuff they had just bought off my credit card together.
Bart may be Charity's ex, but as far as Mark is concerned, the two of them seem to be working together.
Her and Bart, they both facilitated this together. They instigated this whole thing and had it planned.
Mark has reached his limit.
I got a local attorney down here in Conroe. I filed for a divorce. Everything went to court. This time I'm going full force, locked and cocked. I'm ready to go.
Less than a month later, with the divorce proceedings already underway, Mark looks like he might be on the hook for a hefty amount of spousal support. Until he gets a call that could change everything.
The detective called me on the phone and says, I've got some news for you. I found Charity's husband. And I said, Bart, yeah, I know about Bart. He's going like, no, Trevor Hendry, her real husband. And I'm going like, what?
Trevor Hendry, the guy Charity said she'd been a drug mule for, wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He was a husband.
The detective told me they've never been divorced. I'm trying to unscramble all of what I was just told.
Charity had married Bart Bartram in 1999, divorced Bart in 2002, married Trevor just one day later, and then left him without bothering to divorce him.
And he says, guess what? She illegally married Bart Bartram again after she was married to Trevor Hendry. And then she married you.
4 weddings, 1 divorce. Charity is now married to 3 different men.
And I'm going like, hold on. This is bull, right? You're kidding me, right?
That whole entire court case was the biggest mess I have ever seen.
It's baffling. It's upsetting.
The Texas justice system failed me completely.
A detective from the sheriff's department has just discovered that Mark Athens' wife, Charity, is married to 2 other men besides Mark.
And I'm going like, you've got to be kidding me. And he's going like, no. They filed a warrant for her arrest and she was taken into custody.
No, she's facing court tomorrow on the bigamy charge.
Yes, sir. She is in court. She's been indicted by a grand jury. She's going to be in court for the criminal charges tomorrow.
When the detective sent over Charity Bartram's case, it had everything in it that a prosecutor would need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
With Charity now charged with bigamy, Mark expects he won't even have to bother about a divorce, let alone spousal support.
I was elated. I was going like, my God, now all this is over. This is done. She's a bigamist. So none of this stuff goes forward. Divorce proceedings are going to be stopped immediately because I'm not legally married to her. And we've got proof I'm not. Did that happen? No, it did not. Boy, was I shocked. Boy, did I get a kick in the balls. Even after the voided marriage was submitted to Judge McDonald in her court, she refused to accept it. And she still kept coming after me.
Mark fires his attorney and seeks out a tougher advocate.
When Mark called me, every petition that they had filed with the court was getting shut down and denied.
Sarah immediately started trying to get this divorce dismissed because it's bigamy.
It was shocking. This was the first time in all of my years of practice this judge wasn't following the law. Mark was ordered to pay $40,000 as a cash settlement. He was ordered to give her a car. He was also ordered to give other cash settlements with regard to the decree.
At one point in time, I just said, Charity Bartram is not my legal wife. And I locked my heels and I dug in and I said, I'm not paying another dime.
But this only makes things worse.
Charity had filed an enforcement to throw Mark in jail because he hadn't paid his cash settlement. She wanted her money.
The judge held me in contempt of court. There were 5 or 6 orders of contempt.
Mark faces at least a year and a half behind bars.
Essentially, Charity told the court what she wanted and the court granted it.
And what am I supposed to tell my son? I'm sorry, son, but I've got to go to jail for 18 months. Charity showed herself walking on TV, smiling because she knew that day I was going to go to jail. Who does that? Who does that but a professional criminal or the spawn of Satan?
I can't believe that we have someone who is so bold that she files a petition to enforce spousal support with felony charges that are pending against her for bigamy. That's crazy.
Why was the law failing me? It should have been protecting me.
Mark's lawyer brings in the detective who arrested Charity to present proof that she's a bigamist.
This judge saw the police officer in the courtroom, and the judge just wouldn't even give us an opportunity to present the evidence. I was bamboozled, absolutely bamboozled.
Everything that Mark's attorney, Sarah, put out there, she knocked it down. Everything that Charity's attorney, whatever his name is, he's the sorriest attorney I ever saw in my life. She went with it.
Were you already married when you married someone else? One daughter.
At last, Mark's side catches what should be a break in the criminal court.
Today, in court, Ms. Charity Parcham pled guilty to the offense of bigamy.
That basically proves what Mark Athens has been saying in the divorce. She's not really my wife. She is not legally married to me. Therefore, I shouldn't have to pay her a dime.
Charity pled guilty to bigamy, and Judge McDonald still didn't rescind her orders.
Montgomery County Judge Patrice McDonald has ordered Athens to pay $96,000 to Parcham by tomorrow or face jail time.
Sarah knew she's going to put you in jail. Okay, well, I've already talked to my son. Prepare for this. I am not backing down from this.
This wasn't just about his wife being married to other people. This was about his wife taking advantage of him and his son, leaving Mark financially destitute.
The clock is ticking for surgical assistant Mark Athens. With few exceptions, if you've done time in jail in Texas, you can't practice medicine. And yet, in less than 24 hours, that's where Mark is going. Mark's lawyer files a last-minute appeal.
We filed an emergency stay, and we were requesting that the Court of Appeals freeze all of the trial court proceedings.
From what I understand, they had only had it for about 15 minutes before they made a decision. The appellate court overrode Judge McDonald's decision and dismissed it. Told him, basically, leave this man alone. Sarah saved me from going to jail.
It was just a sigh of relief because all along, this is absolutely what he deserved.
But I've got to go to jail. I was pretty emotional just to get it over with. Actually, I did. I cried over it.
3 months after filing for divorce, and barely 5 months after their wedding, Mark's marriage to Charity is officially dissolved. The ordeal is over.
Charity had scammed over $425,000 from me. I had lost funds in over $220,000 in legal fees. Everything that I had, all my retirement was gone. I mean, I lost everything.
The sentence for bigamy in Texas, because it's a third-degree felony, is anywhere from 2 years up to 10 years in prison.
Charity gets 4 years, but not in prison.
She walks away with probation, not a day in jail. After all the people she's hurt, where's the justification in that?
I don't know what's in Charity's future. I hope she doesn't hurt anybody else, but I'm not so sure I can trust that hope.
Some good has come from this ordeal. Dakota discovered he's got a valuable skill set.
Dakota has a knack of sizing people up a hell of a lot better than mine, I can tell you that. So he's already got his license in process through the state of Texas to become a private detective.
I like to find out the truth. I'm like the truth seeker. I want to be the best of the best when it comes to investigations.
In spite of all that Mark lost, there's one precious and irreplaceable thing he managed to win back.
James checks his phone and he's like, Mark wants to talk to us. So James goes over there and Mark says, hey, I am really sorry. And he really was regretful.
The things that I look for in a relationship, I've gotten already. Because I've got a relationship with James and Gina that after what had happened, and me coming back trying to eat crow and apologize, they could have told me to off. But they didn't. Gina and James, I know that if something happens to me or if Dakota needs help, he's going to have it. And I know that.
Now that Charity's gone, Mark is a different person. He's not frustrated all the time. It's back to life as normal.
I'm back on the dating scene. I'm just more thorough now about looking at people. I want to try to find somebody that will love my family and give me the same amount of love and attention that I'm going to give her back.
The young woman left home expecting to come back. That was the detail her family would remember for the rest of their lives. There was no farewell, no suitcase, no warning, no reason to believe that an ordinary evening would become the final night anyone would ever see her alive. She simply disappeared. And for a while, the police treated her disappearance as though there might be an ordinary explanation, a missed appointment, a change of plans, a private decision, a misunderstanding. But then the hours became a day. The day became several days. And eventually, the search became something far darker. Her body was found. The case became a murder investigation. And the questions began. Where had she gone? Who had seen her last? Why had nobody stopped what was happening? And perhaps the most painful question of all, could she have been saved? This is the story of an English cold case that will remain buried beneath decades of paperwork, fading memories and missed opportunities. A young woman disappeared. She was later found murdered. The investigation moved forward, then stalled. And somewhere inside the original police files were details that would eventually force investigators to confront a disturbing possibility. The killer was not invisible. The clues were there. The witnesses were there. The warnings were there. But the system failed to connect them. England in the early years of the case was a different country. Police stations relied heavily on paper files. Information moved slowly. Different departments did not always share information efficiently. Forensic technology was nowhere near what would become decades later. A fingerprint might be useful. A bloodstain might be useful. A witness statement might be useful. But if those pieces remained in separate files, they could become almost meaningless. That was the tragedy. The evidence did not disappear. The connections did. The young woman had a life before she became a name in a police file. She had people who loved her, people who knew her laugh, people who knew how she took her tea, people who knew which clothes she wore when she was happy, people who expected her to call. That night, someone waited for that call. It never came. Her family reported her missing. The first response was cautious. Officers asked questions. Where had she been? Where was she going? Who had she spoken to? Had she argued with anyone? Was there a boyfriend? Was there trouble at work? Was there anything unusual in the days before she vanished? Her family answered everything they could, but there was very little that made sense. She had not disappeared voluntarily. At least, that was what the people closest to her believed. The search began. Police checked familiar locations. Friends were interviewed. Hospitals were contacted. Roads were searched. The public was asked for information. Photographs were distributed. Her name appeared in newspapers. For her family, every ringing telephone became torture. Every knock at the door brought the same terrible possibility. Someone had found her. Then came the discovery. The location was not where investigators expected. She had been found away from the places connected to her normal routine. The discovery transformed the case immediately. This was no longer a missing person investigation. It was murder. The police cordoned off the area. Forensic officers arrived. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Evidence was collected. The body was removed. And the questions became more urgent. Who had brought her there? Was that where she had been killed? Or had she been murdered somewhere else? Had she known her killer? Had she been followed? Had she trusted the wrong person? The first hours of a murder investigation can determine everything that follows. Every footprint matters. Every fiber matters. Every vehicle seen nearby matters. Every telephone call can matter. Every person who suddenly changes their story matters. But the investigation faced problems almost immediately. Some witnesses could not remember exact times. Some statements conflicted. Some information was considered too minor to pursue. And some potential connections were never fully explored. Years later, those decisions would become impossible to ignore. At the time, however, detectives were working with what they had. They built a timeline. The last confirmed sighting. The final known conversation. The moment she was reported missing. The estimated time of death. The location where her body was discovered. Investigators began looking for gaps. The killer had needed time. Time to approach her. Time to control her. Time to move her. Time to leave. Somewhere inside that window was the answer. The police interviewed people who lived nearby. Some remembered cars. Some remembered strangers. Some remembered nothing. One witness recalled hearing something unusual. Another remembered seeing a vehicle. A third remembered a person behaving strangely. But memories are fragile, especially memories collected after tragedy. People remember fear differently. They remember sounds differently. They remember faces differently. A witness can be completely sincere and still be wrong. That made the investigation harder. Then there was the evidence. A small number of forensic items were recovered. Some were examined. Some were preserved. But the technology available at the time could not extract everything they might have contained. A partial fingerprint was noted. A fiber was collected. Other material was stored. None produced an immediate suspect. The case began to slow. That was when the first great failure occurred. Not one dramatic mistake. Not one corrupt officer. Not one decision that destroyed the entire investigation. Something more ordinary. The case became one of many. Investigators moved on. Other crimes demanded attention. Other victims needed answers. The file remained open, but activity diminished. Her family refused to let her disappear again. They kept asking questions. They contacted police. They followed every possible lead. They waited for developments. Sometimes they received updates. Sometimes there was silence. Years passed. The town changed. People moved. Buildings disappeared. Businesses closed. Roads were redesigned. Children became adults. The officers who had investigated the murder retired. Some witnesses died. Some memories disappeared with them. And the case became a cold case. A phrase that sounds clinical. Cold case. 2 words. But for the family, nothing about it was cold. Every birthday still mattered. Every anniversary still hurt. Every unanswered question remained alive. They did not have the luxury of forgetting. The woman had a name. She had a face. She had a future. Someone had taken that future from her, and the person responsible was still free. Then technology changed. DNA testing transformed criminal investigations. Old evidence could suddenly speak. A sample that had been meaningless in the 1980s or 1990s could become critical decades later. Fingerprints could be digitized. Old photographs could be enhanced. Paper records could be searched electronically. Databases could connect crimes separated by hundreds of miles. Cases once considered impossible began to move again. Investigators reopened the file. They did not begin with a theory. They began with the evidence. That decision mattered. They went back to the beginning. They read the original statements. They examined the old photographs. They reviewed the autopsy. They looked at every piece of physical evidence. Nothing was considered too small. Nothing was automatically dismissed. Then they found something. A detail buried inside an old report. A detail that had been recorded decades earlier, but never fully developed. A fingerprint. Not a complete print. Not an obvious smoking gun. Just enough. Investigators ran it through modern systems. There was no immediate match, but the technology had improved. They examined the print again. Then they compared it against other evidence from the case. The fingerprint was not alone. It sat beside a timeline, a witness, a previous statement, and a name. A name that had appeared in the original investigation. The person had been interviewed decades earlier. At the time, police had considered him only a witness. Now investigators looked at him differently. They examined where he had been, what he had said, what he had omitted, and what had changed between his first statement and later accounts. The differences were small, but they were there. A time change, a location change, a detail that had once seemed insignificant suddenly became important. The detectives went back to the original file. The old interview was still there. The handwriting, the signature, the date, everything preserved. And then they discovered something even more troubling. Another officer had written a note beneath the interview. It contained only a few words. Check this. Nothing followed. No further investigation. No additional interview. No explanation. The note had been ignored. For decades. Now a new team of detectives were staring at it. They checked what this referred to. It was a discrepancy in the witness's timeline. A gap of approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes. That was all. But the estimated time of death fell inside that window. Suddenly, the old witness statement looked different. The person who had once been treated as a peripheral witness might have been much closer to the crime than anyone realized. Investigators located him. He was still alive. He was older now. His life had changed. But when detectives arrived, they brought the old statement. They placed it in front of him. Then they asked one question. Do you remember her? The man looked at the photograph. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his expression changed, because he remembered. And the answer he gave would force investigators to reopen every assumption they had made about the night she disappeared. The investigation did not simply fail because the killer was clever. It failed because investigators made assumptions. And once those assumptions entered the case file, they began shaping everything that followed. On July 15th, 1992, Rachel Nichol had gone for a walk across Wimbledon Common with her 2-year-old son, Alex, and her dog. She was 23 years old. It was an ordinary summer day. There was nothing about the morning that suggested it would become one of the most notorious murder investigations in modern British criminal history. Rachel was attacked on the Common. She was stabbed repeatedly. Her young son survived the attack. The brutality shocked the country. But the tragedy did not end at the crime scene. It continued through the investigation. It continued through the courtroom. And it continued for years. The first priority was finding the person responsible. Police began reconstructing Rachel's movements. They searched the Common. They spoke to witnesses. They examined the physical evidence. They looked for anyone who might have seen Rachel shortly before the attack. Among the people in the area that morning was a man named Colin Stagg. Stagg lived near Wimbledon Common. He was interested in the area. He was also someone police quickly became interested in. There were reasons for the suspicion. Some of his behavior appeared unusual. Some of his interests appeared disturbing. And investigators began building a theory around him. But suspicion is not evidence. That distinction would become crucial. Police surveillance was conducted. Investigators attempted to establish whether Stagg had a connection to murder. Then the investigation took an extraordinary turn. An undercover police operation was launched. A female officer posed as a woman interested in Stagg. The operation became known as Lizzie James. The purpose was to obtain information from him. Investigators believed that if Stagg was responsible for Rachel's murder, he might reveal something to the undercover officer. The operation continued for months. Letters were exchanged. Meetings were arranged. The undercover officer encouraged Stagg to talk. The police hoped he would eventually confess, but he did not. There was no genuine confession, no clear admission that he had killed Rachel. Instead, the operation produced conversations that prosecutors later struggled to defend. Stagg was eventually charged with Rachel's murder. The case against him depended heavily on circumstantial evidence and the undercover operation. The prosecution argued that his personality and behavior were significant, but the defense challenged the reliability of the evidence. And then the case began to collapse. In 1994, the prosecution was halted. The judge ruled that the evidence obtained through the undercover operation was inadmissible. The police operation had crossed the line. Stagg was freed. He had spent months under suspicion. His name had been publicly connected with one of Britain's most shocking murders, but he had not been convicted. The real killer remained free. For Rachel's family, this was devastating. Their daughter was still dead. Her son was growing up without her, and the person responsible had disappeared into the population. The investigation had reached a dead end. But Rachel's murder did not disappear. The case remained open. The evidence remained. And years later, forensic science would give investigators another opportunity. The murder had occurred in 1992. DNA technology was already being used. But forensic science was not what it is today. The available evidence was limited. Some samples could not produce a usable profile. Other evidence could not be linked to a suspect. Time passed. Then advances in DNA analysis changed the possibilities. Investigators revisited the evidence. They examined material collected from Rachel's clothing. They looked again at biological evidence recovered after murder. Technology had improved. Samples that once seemed useless could now potentially provide information. The investigation moved again. And this time, detectives were not simply looking at behavior. They were looking at science. A DNA profile was eventually developed from evidence connected to the crime. It did not match Colin Stagg. That fact was critical. The man police had pursued for years was not the killer. The evidence pointed somewhere else. Investigators searched databases. They looked for a match. The profile eventually produced a breakthrough. The DNA was linked to a man named Robert Napper. Napper had a criminal history. He had previously been investigated in connection with violence against women. He had also lived in the area at the time of Rachel's murder. The connection was chilling. For years, investigators had been focused on another man. The actual killer had been living within the same broader area. The investigation shifted completely. Napper became the focus. Detectives examined his history. They discovered a pattern of disturbing behavior. They found evidence connecting him to violence against women. They examined his movements. They reviewed old reports. And suddenly, earlier warnings began to look different. There had been opportunities to identify him, but the investigation had gone in another direction. That was one of the most painful lessons of the case. A murder investigation is not simply about finding evidence. It is about interpreting evidence correctly. If investigators become convinced that one person is responsible, every new piece of information can be viewed through that assumption. Evidence supporting the theory receives attention. Evidence contradicting it may be discounted. The Rachel Nichol investigation became a powerful example of the danger of confirmation bias. The consequences were enormous. An innocent man had been pursued. The real killer remained free. And Rachel's family had to endure years of uncertainty. When Napper was eventually identified through DNA, the case entered a new phase. The evidence was no longer based primarily on theories about personality. It was biological. It connected Napper to crime. He was arrested. The investigation into his background continued. Prosecutors examined the evidence surrounding Rachel's death. Napper was eventually convicted of Rachel's murder. The conviction brought an answer that had been missing for years, but it could not undo what had happened. It could not restore Rachel. It could not give her son back the childhood he should have had with his mother, and it could not erase the years during which an innocent man had been treated as a murderer. The case became larger than one conviction. It became a warning about police investigations, about tunnel vision, about undercover operations, about the danger of pursuing a suspect before the evidence is strong enough, and about the importance of preserving an open mind. Colin Stagg later received compensation after being wrongly prosecuted. He had not committed Rachel's murder, but his life had been profoundly affected by the investigation. The police eventually faced scrutiny over how the case had been handled. The failures were not theoretical. They had consequences. A young woman was dead. A child had lost his mother. An innocent man had been publicly accused, and the killer had remained free for years. The scientific breakthrough eventually corrected the central mistake. DNA pointed investigators away from the original suspect. It pointed toward the real killer. That was the power of forensic evidence. It did not care about personality. It did not care about rumors. It did not care what investigators believed. It simply connected biological evidence to a person. And in Rachel's case, that connection changed everything. For decades, the murder had remained one of Britain's most haunting cases. The image of a young mother walking across Wimbledon Common with her small son became inseparable from the tragedy. Rachel had not been a headline. She had not been a case number. She had been a daughter, a mother, a friend, a young woman whose life should have continued far beyond that summer morning. Her son survived. He grew older. He eventually became an adult, but the memory of what happened remained. The investigation also left another legacy. It demonstrated how quickly a murder investigation can become dangerous when suspicion replaces proof. The first theory can become the only theory. The wrong suspect can become the center of the investigation. And while everyone is looking in one direction, the real killer can remain untouched. Rachel's case showed the cost of that failure. It took years to correct, years that could never be returned. The final answer came through evidence that had been there all along. Not a dramatic confession, not a mysterious message, not a last-minute revelation. Science. DNA. A biological trace left behind at the crime. Something the killer could not explain away. Something that survived long after memories faded and investigations changed hands. That evidence eventually led police to Robert Napper, and it finally established what the earlier investigation had failed to establish. Colin Stagg was not Rachel's killer. The man police had spent years pursuing was innocent. The real killer had been somewhere else. That realization transformed the meaning of the entire case. The question was no longer simply who murdered Rachel. It became how the investigation had gone so wrong. How could an innocent man become the focus? How could the real killer remain unidentified? And how many opportunities had been lost? Those questions will remain part of Rachel Nichols' story, because solving a murder is not always the same thing as correcting an investigation. The conviction of the real killer brought justice in the legal sense, but justice could not erase the failures. It could not erase the years. It could not erase the fear and grief experienced by Rachel's family, and it could not give Rachel back to the child who survived that terrible morning. What remained was her name, Rachel Nichols. A young mother, a woman who went for a walk on Wimbledon Common, a victim whose murder shocked Britain, and whose case eventually became a lesson written into the history of British policing. The killer was eventually found. The evidence finally spoke, but it spoke years after the crime. And by then, the damage caused by the original investigation had already become part of the story. That is what makes the case so haunting. The truth was there, but it took years before investigators were willing or able to see it clearly. The problem with failed investigation is that the consequences do not end when the detectives leave the scene. They follow the victim's family home. They follow them through birthdays, through anniversaries, through ordinary mornings when the world continues as if nothing happened. For Rachel Nichols' family, the murder never became an old story. Rachel was still 23. Her son Alex was still a small child. He had survived the attack, but he had lost his mother. And while the investigation focused on finding a killer, the family was forced to live with another uncertainty. Would the police find the right man? At first, there was confidence. The murder had generated enormous public attention. Wimbledon Common was searched. Witnesses were questioned. The public was asked to come forward. The police needed information about anyone seen in the area that morning. The pressure was intense. A young mother had been murdered in daylight. Her child had been left alive beside her. Bryn wanted answers. The police needed a suspect. And Colin Stagg became that suspect. Stagg was questioned. His background was examined. His behavior was analyzed. Investigators became increasingly convinced that he could be responsible. But the evidence was not straightforward. There was no confession. There was no forensic evidence directly tying him to Rachel's murder. There was no decisive eyewitness identification placing him at the exact moment of the killing. Instead, investigators relied heavily on their interpretation of his personality and behavior. That distinction became critical. The police were no longer simply asking, what happened to Rachel? They were increasingly asking, how can we prove that Stagg did it? That shift may have been subtle, but it changed the direction of the entire investigation. The undercover operation was developed to obtain information from Stagg. A female officer assumed the identity of Lizzie James. She developed contact with him. The operation was carefully constructed. The hope was simple. If Stagg was responsible for Rachel's murder, perhaps he would eventually admit it. But the conversations did not produce the confession investigators wanted. Instead, the officer encouraged Stagg to discuss fantasies and violent subjects. The material was disturbing, but disturbing conversation was not the same as evidence of murder. The distinction would later become central to the court's decision. Stagg was eventually charged. For Rachel's family, the news could have represented the beginning of the end. A suspect had been identified. A prosecution was coming. Perhaps the nightmare was finally approaching its conclusion. But then the case collapsed. The judge excluded the evidence obtained through the undercover operation. The prosecution had not established a sufficiently reliable connection between Stagg and the murder. The case against him failed. He was released, and the real killer remained free. For Rachel's family, it was another devastating blow. The person accused of murdering her was not going to prison. The investigation had not produced justice. Instead, it had produced another question. Had the police pursued the wrong man? That question would remain unresolved for years. Stagg's name had become associated with the murder. Even though he had not been convicted, suspicion had followed him. The public had heard the allegations. The newspapers had reported them. His life had been changed, and the police still did not know who had killed Rachel. The investigation returned to the evidence. But by then, time had already become the enemy. Witness memories faded. People moved. Records aged. The original crime scene was long gone. Wimbledon Common remained, but the exact circumstances of the attack could not simply be reconstructed from the landscape. Every year that passed created another layer between detectives, and the morning of July 15th, 1992, then forensic science began to change the possibilities. DNA profiling was becoming increasingly powerful. Samples preserved from older cases could be revisited. A tiny biological trace could potentially identify a person who had never been considered a suspect. For the Rachel Nichol investigation, that possibility was enormous, because the original investigation had produced a major problem. There was a suspect, but there was no convincing scientific evidence against him. Modern forensic science offered a way to step outside the original theory. Investigators could ask a different question. Not who looked suspicious, not who behaved strangely, not who fit a psychological profile, but whose DNA was actually present. The distinction was profound. Investigators revisited the biological evidence connected with Rachel. Samples were examined using improved techniques. The results changed the direction of the case. The DNA profile did not point to Colin Stagg. It pointed elsewhere. The evidence eventually identified Robert Napper. Napper was already known to authorities. His background was deeply disturbing. He had a history of violence and sexual offenses. He had also been connected to the geographical area around Wimbledon Common. The discovery forced investigators to reconsider the entire case. The man they had spent years pursuing was not responsible. The man they had not successfully identified was. And the implications were enormous, because the DNA evidence did more than identify another suspect. It exposed a weakness of the original investigation. The case had been driven for years by a theory. The theory had been wrong. The science had finally broken through it. Napper's name now appeared at the center of the investigation. Detectives examined his history. They looked at previous reports. They examined allegations involving other women. They reviewed his movements, and patterns began to emerge. The possibility that Rachel's murder was connected to a broader history of violence became impossible to ignore. Investigators also had to confront another painful question. Had Napper been identifiable earlier? Could he have been stopped? Could Rachel have been protected? Those questions were harder to answer. Criminal investigations are full of information that only becomes meaningful later. A warning can look ordinary when nobody knows what it means. A suspicious behavior can seem insignificant until another crime occurs. A name can sit inside a database without anyone realizing its importance. That is one of the cruelest features of cold cases. The answer may have been close, but nobody knew which piece mattered. The identification of Napper eventually led to further investigation. The evidence against him was examined. The case moved toward prosecution. The conviction that followed finally established criminal responsibility for Rachel's murder. But the story did not end with the conviction, because Colin Stagg had been wrongly accused. He had spent years carrying the consequences of an accusation that should never have resulted in a prosecution. The police investigation became a subject of scrutiny. Questions were asked about the undercover operation. Questions were asked about profiling. Questions were asked about the way evidence had been interpreted. And questions were asked about why investigators had become so convinced of Stagg's guilt without decisive forensic proof. The case became a warning. Not because every investigator had acted maliciously, but because investigators are human. They form theories. They search for patterns. They want to solve crimes. And once a theory becomes strong enough, there is a danger that evidence begins to serve the theory instead of testing it. That is confirmation bias. In a murder investigation, it can be catastrophic. The Rachel Nichol case demonstrated that danger in the most painful way possible. A young woman was dead. Her child had lost his mother. Her family wanted justice. Police wanted conviction. And the pressure to find an answer created the risk of accepting an answer that had not been proved. The undercover operation became one of the clearest examples. The officer had been instructed to gain Stagg's confidence. She encouraged him to discuss subjects that were disturbing. But the conversations did not establish that he had murdered Rachel. The evidence could create an impression. It could make a person appear dangerous. But a murder conviction requires more. It requires proof. When the court rejected the evidence, that distinction became unavoidable. Stagg walked free. The case remained unsolved. And somewhere else, the actual killer was still living his life. That is what makes the chronology so painful. While investigators focused on Stagg, Rachel's killer had not been brought to justice. The passage of time did not make the murder less important. It made it harder to solve. But the family continued to demand answers. Rachel's mother and relatives continued to live with the consequences. Her son grew up. The little boy who survived the attack became an adult. He had to grow up knowing that his mother had been taken from him. The case became part of his identity before he was old enough to understand what had happened. There was no way to restore the years he lost. No conviction could do that. No police apology could do that. No amount of money could do that. But finding the real killer mattered. It mattered because Rachel deserved the truth. It mattered because her family deserved to know who had taken her life. And it mattered because the failure to identify the killer had left another danger in the community. The eventual DNA breakthrough changed that. Robert Napper was identified. The evidence was strong enough to establish his involvement. The investigation that had once been dominated by speculation finally had scientific direction. and the contrast was stark. The original investigation had focused heavily on what investigators believed about a suspect. The later investigation focused on what the evidence could prove. That difference changed everything. The case also became a landmark in discussions about policing. Investigators learned painful lessons about tunnel vision, about undercover operations, about psychological profiling, about the dangers of building a prosecution around character rather than evidence, and about the importance of keeping alternative possibilities alive. Rachel's murder was not solved because someone suddenly remembered a dramatic clue. It was solved because investigators eventually returned to the physical evidence. They allowed science to challenge the old assumptions, and the science pointed to someone else, someone who had not been successfully identified during the original investigation, someone whose history made the missed opportunity even more disturbing. The story of Rachel Nichol, therefore, became two stories at once. One was the story of a young woman murdered on Wimbledon Common. The other was a story of an investigation that went badly wrong. Both stories mattered. Neither could be separated from the other. Rachel's life was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a mother. She was a daughter. She was a person with plans and relationships and a future. That future ended on a summer morning. Her son survived. Her family survived. But they carried the consequences for decades. And when the real killer was finally identified, the answer came with another painful realization. Finding the killer did not erase the years when an innocent man had been accused. It did not erase the mistakes. It did not erase the questions. It simply meant that, after years of uncertainty, the central truth of the murder could finally be established. Rachel had been killed. Colin Stagg had not killed her. Robert Napper was responsible. And the forensic evidence that ultimately connected Napper to the crime demonstrated something investigators had failed to appreciate at the beginning. The smallest trace can outlive the largest theory. A biological sample can wait. A preserved piece of evidence can wait. A truth buried in a case file can wait. For years, for decades, until someone finally looks at it without assuming they already know the answer. Rachel never received a chance to tell her own story. So the evidence had to speak for her. And when it finally did, it did something the original investigation had failed to do. It pointed away from the man investigators believed was guilty and toward the man who actually was. The name Robert Napper had already appeared in police records long before investigators understood what it meant. That was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The information existed. The warning signs existed. The history existed. But the pieces were not connected when Rachel needed them to be. Napper had a documented history of serious violence against women. He had been involved in previous incidents. He had come to the attention of authorities. But none of that automatically meant he was responsible for Rachel's murder. That distinction mattered. A criminal history is not proof of a specific crime. Investigators still needed evidence. And eventually, they found it. DNA changed the case. It did not rely on a psychological theory. It did not depend on an undercover officer persuading someone to talk. It did not require investigators to interpret strange behavior. It was physical evidence, a biological connection, a scientific link between the crime and the man responsible. For Rachel's family, the development was enormous. For Colin Stagg, it was equally significant. The man who had been publicly associated with Rachel's murder was finally cleared of responsibility. But clearing an innocent man does not erase what happened to him. Stagg had been arrested. He had been prosecuted. He had lived under suspicion. His name had become connected to a murder he did not commit. The investigation had affected his life in ways that could not simply be reversed. The case became an example of what happens when police become convinced that they have found their suspect before they have found their evidence. And that lesson became particularly important because the investigation had involved one of the most controversial undercover operations in British policing. The Lizzie James operation had been designed to extract information from Stagg. The officer created an artificial relationship. She encouraged him to speak. She attempted to draw out an admission. But the operation produced no genuine confession to Rachel's murder. Instead, It produced material that prosecutors believed could help establish his character. The court disagreed. The evidence was excluded. And once the prosecution collapsed, the central theory of the investigation collapsed with it. That should have forced a complete reassessment. But the damage had already been done. The real killer remained unidentified. Rachel's family remained without justice. And years continued to pass. The public gradually moved on. Other crimes replaced the headlines. New investigations occupied police resources. The case became part of the history of Wimbledon Common. But for Rachel's family, history was not enough. Rachel was still missing from every family photograph taken after 1992. She was missing from birthdays, missing from Christmas, missing from ordinary conversations. Her son grew older without the mother who should have been there. The emotional consequences were permanent. Then forensic science reopened the door. DNA analysis had become dramatically more sophisticated. Evidence that had once been impossible to interpret could now provide a profile. Investigators revisited the material connected with Rachel's murder. The results were decisive. The DNA did not belong to Stagg. It pointed toward Robert Napper. The name forced detectives to reconsider earlier information. Napper had lived in the wider area. He had a history of violence. He had come to police attention. And the scientific evidence connected him to Rachel. The case finally had the thing the original investigation had lacked: a direct forensic link. The investigation moved rapidly. Napper was arrested. His history was examined. Additional evidence was considered. And the prosecution built its case around the scientific findings and the circumstances surrounding Rachel's death. The eventual conviction brought a legal answer, but it also exposed an uncomfortable question. Why had the investigation taken so long? The answer was not simply that technology had been unavailable. It was also that investigators had gone down the wrong path. The focus on Stagg consumed enormous time and attention. Once investigators believed he was responsible, the investigation became increasingly centered around proving that belief. The undercover operation was the clearest example. Instead of asking what evidence connected Stagg to Rachel, the police attempted to create a situation in which Stagg might reveal something incriminating. That approach failed, and when it failed, the real question should have been asked immediately. Who else? That question eventually led to Napper. But years had passed. Rachel's son had grown up. The original detectives had retired. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Memories had faded. Evidence had survived, but people had not. Cold cases are often described as mysteries waiting to be solved. But they are also battles against time. Every year makes a witness less certain. Every year creates another opportunity for evidence to be lost. Every year makes a family wait longer. Rachel's family waited. They waited through the failed prosecution. They waited through the years when the murder remained unsolved. They waited while the public debate shifted toward police methods. And they waited for the one thing they had wanted from the beginning: the truth. When Napper was identified, the truth was painful. Rachel had been murdered by a man whose history already contained serious warnings. The investigation had not connected those warnings to her case. Instead, an innocent man had become the center of attention. That was the tragedy within the tragedy. There were two victims of the investigative failure. Rachel was a victim of murder. Stagg was a victim of a wrongful prosecution. And behind both was a system struggling to understand how it had gone wrong. The case prompted scrutiny of police practices. Investigators examined how suspects were profiled, how evidence was assessed, how undercover operations were designed, how alternative suspects were considered, and how investigators could prevent a theory from becoming an obsession. The lesson was simple. A suspect should never become more important than the evidence. Once that happens, the investigation could become trapped. Every fact is interpreted through one explanation. A suspicious detail becomes proof. An innocent explanation becomes an excuse. Contradictory evidence becomes something to be dismissed. And the investigation slowly stops asking whether the theory is correct. Instead, it asks how to defend it. Rachel's case demonstrated the danger. The original investigation had a suspect. It did not have the science to support the theory. Years later, Science produced the answer, and that answer was different. The DNA evidence did not confirm the original theory. It destroyed it. That is why the forensic breakthrough mattered so much. It did not merely identify Robert Napper. It proved that the investigation had been looking in the wrong direction. The evidence forced police to start again. And this time, they had a different standard. They needed facts, not impressions, not personality, not rumors, not psychological assumptions. Facts. The result was a case that finally established responsibility for Rachel's murder. But the emotional weight remained. Rachel had been 23. Her son was 2. She had gone for a walk. She did not return. That simple fact remained more powerful than every courtroom argument. The investigation could be analyzed for years. Police procedures could be criticized. The undercover operation could be debated. DNA evidence could be examined. But none of it changed the human reality. A mother had been taken from her child. A family had been forced to wait for answers. And the person who killed her had remained free for years. When the case was finally resolved, there was no triumphant ending. There could not be. There was only an answer. And sometimes an answer is the closest thing a family can get to justice. The story also showed why cold case investigations matter. Old evidence is not necessarily dead evidence. A fingerprint can remain. A DNA sample can remain. A photograph can remain. A statement can remain. And sometimes the meaning of those things changes when viewed with modern knowledge. That was what happened here. The evidence had not suddenly appeared. It had been waiting. Science changed. Investigators changed. The question changed. And eventually the evidence was interpreted correctly. For Rachel, it came too late. For her son, there was no way to recover the childhood that had been taken from him. For her family, there was no way to undo decades of grief. But the truth finally had a name: Robert Napper. And the investigation finally had to acknowledge another name as well: Colin Stagg. Not as a killer, but as the man who had been wrongly pursued. That distinction was essential, because solving one crime does not justify committing another injustice. The pursuit of justice must include the innocent. It must protect victims. It must protect suspects from wrongful prosecution. And it must demand evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny. Rachel's case demonstrated what happens when those principles fail. The consequences spread far beyond one courtroom. They affected an entire family. They affected an innocent man. They affected confidence in policing. And they changed the way investigators thought about evidence. The case became a warning written into British criminal justice. Do not confuse suspicion with proof. Do not mistake a disturbing personality for a murderer. Do not allow a theory to become more important than the facts. And never stop asking the question that investigators sometimes fear most. What if we are wrong? That question might have changed everything. It might have redirected the investigation earlier. It might have prevented an innocent man from being prosecuted. It might have brought investigators closer to the real killer sooner. But history cannot be rewritten. Rachel's life cannot be restored. The lost years cannot be returned. The mistakes cannot be undone. All that remains is the evidence and the lessons. And perhaps that is why the case continues to matter. Because Rachel's name should not be remembered only as a murder victim. She should be remembered as a young mother whose life was taken. Her son should not be remembered only as the child who survived the attack. He was a child who lost his mother. An investigation should not be remembered only as a famous police failure. It should be remembered as a warning. A warning about what happens when investigators decide they know the answer too early. A warning about what happens when character replaces evidence. A warning about what happens when a theory becomes more powerful than the truth. The real killer was eventually identified. The science finally spoke. And the evidence pointed to the man responsible. But the most haunting part of the case was not the moment of arrest. It was a realization that the investigation had spent years looking in the wrong direction, while Rachel's family waited, while her son grew up, while an innocent man carried the weight of an accusation, and while the real killer remained free. The truth eventually surfaced, But truth delayed is not the same as justice delivered on time. For Rachel, there was no second chance. There was only the memory of a young woman walking across Wimbledon Common on a summer morning. A mother, a daughter, a life interrupted. And decades later, the evidence finally told investigators what they should have been asking from the beginning. Not who looked guilty, not who seemed strange, not who fit a theory, but who did the evidence lead to? The answer was Robert Napper, and that answer changed the case forever. By the time the investigation finally turned toward Robert Napper, the passage of time had already changed almost everything. The investigators were different. The technology was different. The public memory was different. But Rachel was still the same young woman at the center of the case. 23 years old, a mother, a daughter, a woman whose life had been violently interrupted on Wimbledon Common. For years, the investigation had been dominated by one question. Was Colin Stagg the killer? That question had consumed police attention. It had consumed newspaper headlines. It had consumed courtroom arguments. And eventually, it had consumed years. But the DNA evidence forced investigators to ask a completely different question. If Stagg was not responsible, then who was? That question had an answer. Robert Napper. The name did not emerge from a dramatic confession. It emerged from forensic evidence. That distinction mattered, because the entire investigation had already demonstrated how dangerous it could be to build a case around assumptions. Now investigators had something different. They had science. The DNA evidence linked Napper to Rachel. The connection was not based on his personality. It was not based on rumors. It was not based on the fact that detectives found him disturbing. It was physical evidence. And that changed the investigation immediately. Detectives began examining Napper's background. They looked at his previous contact with police. They examined reports involving violence. They studied his movements. They looked at what was known about him during the period surrounding Rachel's murder. The picture became increasingly disturbing. Napper had a history that should have attracted serious attention. Yet the original investigation had not successfully connected him to Rachel's murder. Instead, investigators had focused on another man. That realization created an uncomfortable contrast. The wrong man had been placed under intense scrutiny. The right man had remained unidentified, and Rachel's family had been left waiting. For them, the passing years were not an abstract concept. A year meant another Christmas without Rachel, another birthday, another anniversary, another reminder that a child was growing up without his mother. Alex had been only 2 years old when Rachel was killed. He was too young to understand the full meaning of what had happened, but he would grow up carrying the consequences. The photographs remained. The memories remained. The absence remained. A mother is not replaced simply because a child becomes older. The loss changes shape. It does not disappear. And while Rachel's family lived with that loss, the investigation itself became part of the national conversation. The case was no longer only about murder. It became a debate about police methods, about profiling, about the use of undercover officers, about the danger of pursuing a suspect because investigators believed he looked like the kind of person who might commit the crime. The case raised questions that went far beyond Wimbledon Common. How much weight should police place on a suspect's personality? How far should undercover officers go to obtain information? When does an investigation cross the line between gathering evidence and creating a situation designed to produce incriminating behavior? And what happens when the person at the center of that operation is innocent? Colin Stagg's experience became a warning. He had been accused. He had been prosecuted. The prosecution failed. And later forensic evidence showed that he was not Rachel's killer. That meant the investigation had not simply failed to solve a murder. It had directed enormous attention toward the wrong person. The consequences were serious. An innocent man had suffered. The victim's family had waited. And the real killer had remained free. The case demonstrated a principle that sounds obvious, but is remarkably difficult to maintain under pressure. Investigators must be willing to abandon their favorite theory. That is especially difficult in a high-profile murder. The public wants an arrest. The media wants a name. Families want answers. Police officers want progress. The pressure builds. And once a suspect emerges, every new detail can appear to strengthen the theory. But evidence does not become stronger simply because investigators want it to be true. That was the danger. The undercover operation involving Stagg produced conversations that were disturbing. But disturbing conversations did not prove that he had murdered Rachel. The court ultimately rejected the evidence. The prosecution collapsed. The case remained unresolved. And that should have been a moment of complete reassessment. Instead, the investigation had already spent years moving in one direction. The real breakthrough came only when forensic evidence forced a different path. DNA became the turning point. The technology allowed investigators to revisit evidence that had existed since the beginning. The evidence had been preserved. That was crucial because time had not destroyed everything. Rachel's body had been examined. Evidence had been collected. Samples had been retained. Records had been preserved. And decades later, forensic science could extract information that earlier investigators could not. The result was devastatingly clear. The DNA was not Stagg's. It pointed to Napper. For Rachel's family, the development must have brought conflicting emotions. There was relief. There was anger. There was grief. There was the possibility of justice. But there was also the unavoidable realization that years had been lost. Years when the wrong man had been pursued. Years when the real killer had not been held accountable. Years when Rachel's family had lived without a definitive answer. Finding the killer did not erase those years. It simply gave them meaning. The evidence established a truth that the original investigation had failed to reach. Napper was responsible. And once that truth was established, investigators could examine the original case with a different perspective. Old decisions looked different. Old assumptions looked dangerous. Old evidence looked more important. The question became not only how Napper was identified, but how he had escaped attention for so long. The answer lay partly in the nature of investigations. Police officers are not working with perfect information. They are working with fragments. A witness remembers something. A report records something else. A forensic sample produces limited results. A suspect behaves strangely. A vehicle is seen. A telephone call is reported. Each piece is incomplete. The investigator has to decide which pieces belong together. That is where mistakes can happen. One wrong assumption can change the entire map. In Rachel's case, the focus on Stagg became a powerful example. Once he became the central suspect, the investigation began interpreting him through that lens. His interest became evidence of danger. His behavior became evidence of guilt. His conversations became evidence of murderous intent. But the physical evidence did not support the conclusion. The later DNA evidence demonstrated that. And when science contradicted the theory had to fall. The lesson was painful. A person can appear suspicious and still be innocent. A person can appear ordinary and still be dangerous. The real challenge in criminal investigation is separating appearance from evidence. Rachel's case showed exactly what happens when that separation becomes blurred. The tragedy also extended to the public. People had trusted the police to solve the murder. They had watched the headlines. They had heard that a suspect had been arrested. They had heard about the undercover operation. Then the prosecution collapsed. The killer was still out there. Years later, the public learned that the original suspect had not been responsible. The real killer had been identified through DNA. The story was shocking because it revealed how uncertain the search for truth can become when investigators move too quickly toward a conclusion. But beneath the controversy was Rachel herself. That was the part that could easily disappear beneath the headlines. The police operation, the courtroom, the media coverage, the compensation, the forensic breakthrough, the debate over investigative methods. All of those things became part of the case. But Rachel was the reason the case existed. She was the person who had lost everything. Her son was the child who had to grow up without her. Her family was a family forced to wait. And the public attention could never change that. A murder investigation can become an enormous institutional event. Files multiply. Detectives change. Lawyers become involved. Experts testify. New technology arrives. But at the center is always a human being. Someone whose life was there one moment and gone the next. Rachel's death happened quickly. The consequences lasted decades. That contrast is one of the most painful features of case. A single morning created years of consequences. The murder itself lasted moments. The investigation lasted years. The grief lasted a lifetime. And the mistakes made during those years became part of the historical record. The eventual identification of Napper showed the importance of returning to evidence with fresh eyes. A cold case cannot always be solved by finding something new. Sometimes it is solved by understanding something old. That is what made the forensic breakthrough so powerful. The evidence had survived. The science caught up. And suddenly the case could move again. The investigators no longer needed to ask whether Stagg behaved strangely. They needed to ask whether the physical evidence connected him to Rachel. It did not. They needed to ask whether the DNA connected someone else. It did. That difference was enormous. The case finally moved from suspicion to proof. And that was the point at which the investigation could finally identify the person responsible. But even then, the story did not become simple. A conviction could establish responsibility. It could not repair family. It could not return a mother to her child. It could not erase the years of uncertainty. It could not erase what happened to Colin Stagg. And it could not undo the mistakes that had allowed the investigation to become trapped inside the wrong theory. The case therefore became something larger than the identity of a killer. It became a lesson in the cost of investigative tunnel vision. It showed how easily an investigation can become attached to one suspect. It showed how difficult it can be to admit that the theory is wrong. And it showed how powerful forensic evidence can be when it is allowed to challenge assumptions. The most important evidence did not shout. It did not arrive with a confession. It did not appear on a newspaper front page. It existed quietly in preserved forensic material, waiting for technology, waiting for another investigation, waiting for someone to ask a better question. That question eventually led investigators to Robert Napper. And when the DNA evidence connected him to Rachel, the old investigation could no longer be defended in the same way. The central assumption had been wrong. The real killer had been elsewhere. Rachel's family finally had an answer, but an answer is not the same thing as healing. There are wounds that remain even after conviction. There are memories that do not disappear because a courtroom has reached a verdict. There are childhoods that cannot be reconstructed. There are years that cannot be returned. Rachel's son had already grown up. The little boy who survived the attack had become a man. He could never have his mother back. No conviction could change that. But the truth mattered. It mattered because Rachel deserved to have her murder correctly understood. It mattered because her family deserved to know who was responsible. And it mattered because an innocent man deserved to be recognized as innocent. The case left behind a warning that remains relevant to every major investigation. Do not let suspicion become certainty. Do not let a theory become a verdict. Do not confuse strained behavior with proof. And never stop testing the evidence simply because an explanation feels convincing. The truth does not care how convincing a theory sounds. It survives outside the theory. It waits in the evidence. And sometimes it takes decades before someone finally sees it. For Rachel Nichol, that wait was far too long. Her life had been reduced to a case file. Her death became a national headline. Her family became part of a decades-long investigation. And the man who killed her was eventually identified. But the story remains painful because the system that was supposed to find him had first spent years looking somewhere else. That is the legacy of the case. Not only that a killer was eventually found, but that an innocent man had been pursued. Not only that DNA solved the central mystery, but that the evidence had to overcome years of investigative assumptions. Not only that Rachel finally received a measure of justice, but that the justice came after a delay that her family could never recover. The last word belongs to the evidence, not the headlines, not the theories, not the suspicions. The evidence. It pointed to Robert Napper, and in doing so, it finally forced the investigation to confront the question it should have been asking from the beginning. Who actually did this? The answer had been waiting for years. Rachel's name had never disappeared. Her family had never stopped remembering. And the evidence had never forgotten. The investigation eventually caught up with the truth. But Rachel's life could not wait. That is what makes the case so haunting. The killer was eventually found. The innocent man was eventually cleared. The police failures were eventually exposed. But none of those outcomes could change the most important fact of all. On a summer morning in 1992, a young mother went walking with her child. She did not come home. Everything that followed began with that absence. And decades later, after false leads, failed assumptions, a collapsed prosecution, and a forensic breakthrough, the truth finally emerged from the evidence. Too late to save Rachel, but not too late to tell the world who took her life. The case did not become a national scandal because one detective made one mistake. It became a scandal because the mistakes accumulated. One assumption, one theory, one suspect, one investigation built around the belief that the answer had already been found. And while that theory grew stronger inside police files, the truth remained outside it. Rachel Nichol was still dead. Her family was still waiting. And the man responsible had still not been held accountable. The passage of time made the failure harder to see and harder to correct. In the months after Rachel's murder, the investigation had been under enormous pressure. The killing had happened in daylight. Rachel had been walking with her young son. The violence of the attack shocked the public. The image of a child surviving beside his murdered mother became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. People wanted reassurance. They wanted the police to identify the killer. They wanted to believe that someone responsible for such a brutal crime could be found quickly. Instead, investigators struggled. Witnesses provided information. The common was searched. The police examined Rachel's movements. They attempted to reconstruct what had happened, but the evidence did not immediately reveal a clear suspect. Then Colin Stagg entered the investigation, and once investigators began to suspect him, the case changed. Stagg became the person police wanted to understand. His personality was examined. His interests were examined. His behavior was examined. Investigators searched for signs that might support their theory. The problem was that none of those things established that he had killed Rachel. The absence of decisive physical evidence should have remained central. Instead, suspicion grew around circumstances that could be interpreted in different ways. The investigation needed something stronger. It needed a confession. That desire eventually produced the undercover operation. The police introduced an undercover officer into Stagg's life. She used the name Lizzie James. The operation was carefully planned. The officer developed a relationship with Stagg. She encouraged him to talk. She attempted to create an environment in which he might reveal information about Rachel's murder. Investigators hoped that, if Stagg was responsible, pressure and emotional manipulation would eventually cause him to admit it. But the admission never came. Instead, the operation produced conversations that were later regarded as deeply problematic. Stagg discussed sexual and violent fantasies. He said things that could sound disturbing. But the crucial question was never whether Stagg was strange. The question was whether he had murdered Rachel. Those were not the same thing. The prosecution eventually attempted to use the undercover material, but the court rejected it. The judge concluded that the evidence had been improperly obtained and could not safely support prosecution. The case against Stagg collapsed. He walked out of court, and the investigation was left with a devastating problem. The police had spent years pursuing a man they could not prove had committed the murder. The real killer remained free. For Rachel's family, there was no relief. The person who had been accused was not responsible. The person who was responsible had not been identified. The murder remained unsolved. The public attention slowly moved elsewhere, but the family could not move on. Rachel had been a young mother. Her son was only 2 years old when she was killed. He survived the attack, but survival came with an enormous cost. He grew up without the mother who should have watched him become older. There would be no ordinary childhood memories with her. No conversations as he grew. No mother standing beside him at important moments. The loss was permanent. And while he grew up, The investigation remained trapped in the past. Years passed, then decades. The case became one of Britain's most notorious examples of investigative failure. But the story of the real killer was still incomplete. Robert Napper had not disappeared from history. He had a background. He had previous contact with authorities. He had a history of violence. Yet investigators had not successfully connected him to Rachel's murder at the time. That changed when advances in forensic science created a new opportunity. DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigation. The technology allowed investigators to examine biological evidence at a level that had not been possible during the original investigation. Old evidence could be tested again. Samples could be analyzed with greater sensitivity. A case that had once seemed impossible could suddenly contain a path forward. The Rachel Nichol investigation was reopened with a different approach. The question was no longer based on who investigators thought looked suspicious. The question was what the physical evidence could actually establish. That difference was enormous. The DNA evidence eventually linked Robert Napper to Rachel's murder. The discovery changed the entire case. Suddenly, the investigation had a forensic connection that the original theory about Stagg had never possessed. The man who had been the center of the original investigation was not the man identified by the science. That fact was devastating. It meant the investigation had been looking in the wrong direction, and the consequences of that error were now impossible to ignore. Napper became the focus. Investigators examined his history. They examined his previous offenses. They examined what was known about his movements. They revisited information that had previously appeared unrelated. The case began to look different. Old facts acquired new meaning. A name that had once been peripheral became central. A history that had once seemed separate from Rachel's murder became relevant. And the DNA evidence provided a connection that earlier investigators had lacked. For Rachel's family, the development must have been overwhelming. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a scientific answer. But that answer also carried another truth. The wrong man had suffered. Colin Stagg had been arrested and prosecuted. He had lived under the shadow of suspicion. His name had been connected publicly to a murder he did not commit. The failure of the original investigation had affected him profoundly. When the truth emerged, the distinction became unavoidable. Stagg was not the killer. Napper was. Two names, two completely different roles. One had been wrongly accused. The other had committed the murder. The difference between them represented the entire problem with the original investigation. Suspicion had been mistaken for proof. The later forensic evidence demonstrated what the earlier investigation had failed to establish. And that created a difficult question for British policing. How had the investigation become so convinced of Stagg's guilt? The answer involved more than one individual. It involved a process. Investigators form hypotheses. That is normal. They develop theories because they need a framework for understanding a crime. But a theory must remain a theory. It must be tested. It must be challenged. It must be abandoned when the evidence contradicts it. In Rachel's case, that did not happen quickly enough. The Stagg theory became powerful. The undercover operation was created around it. The investigation sought information that might confirm it. And when the evidence failed to deliver the expected confession, the theory had already consumed too much time and attention. That is the danger known as tunnel vision. The investigation narrows. Alternative explanations become less visible. Investigators begin searching for evidence that supports their belief. And the possibility that the belief itself is wrong becomes harder to confront. Rachel's case became a devastating illustration of that danger. The eventual DNA breakthrough did something that years of interviews and surveillance had failed to do. It forced the investigators to start from the evidence, not from the suspect, not from the theory, not from the personality, from the evidence. And the evidence led somewhere else. It led to Robert Napper. That scientific connection ultimately supported the prosecution against him. Napper was convicted of Rachel's murder. The legal process finally established responsibility, but the conviction could not erase the investigation that came before it. The case had already changed the lives of too many people. Rachel's family had spent years waiting. Her son had grown up. Colin Stagg had endured a wrongful prosecution. The police had been forced to confront serious questions about their methods. The public had witnessed a case in which the original suspect was not the murderer, and the real killer was eventually identified through forensic evidence. The contrast was impossible to miss. At the beginning, investigators had relied heavily on interpretation. At the end, they had something much harder to argue with: DNA. The science did not care about the suspect's personality. It did not care about public pressure. It did not care about the headlines. It did not care about what investigators wanted to believe. It provided a connection. And that connection changed everything. Rachel's story therefore became inseparable from the lessons of the investigation. The case showed why physical evidence matters. It showed why alternative suspects must remain possible. It showed why investigators must question their own assumptions. And it showed why a cold case can sometimes be solved not by discovering a completely new clue, but by examining an old clue with new technology. The evidence had been preserved. The technology improved. The question changed. And eventually, the answer emerged. But there was another painful reality. The answer came after years that could never be returned. Rachel's family could not recover the time lost. Her son could not recover his childhood with his mother. Stagg could not erase the experience of being accused. And the police could not undo the decisions made during the original investigation. The only thing that could be done was to acknowledge what happened. The original theory was wrong. The real killer was identified. The evidence finally spoke. And Rachel's name was separated from the uncertainty that had surrounded her murder for so long. That separation mattered, because a victim should never become lost inside the mistakes of the investigation. Rachel should not be remembered merely as the center of a controversial police operation. She should be remembered as a young woman whose life ended violently. She should be remembered as a mother whose child survived her murder. She should be remembered as a daughter whose family refused to stop seeking answers. And she should be remembered as the reason the investigation mattered. The headlines eventually changed. The case was no longer simply an unsolved murder. It became a solved murder surrounded by questions about how justice had been pursued. That distinction is important. Solving the crime did not mean the investigation had been successful from the beginning. In fact, the eventual solution exposed how badly the original investigation had gone wrong. The man first pursued was innocent. The man ultimately identified was the killer. The difference was revealed through evidence, and the evidence had survived long enough to overcome the mistakes. That is perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story. The truth had not vanished. It had been buried beneath assumptions, buried beneath old reports, buried beneath the reputation of a suspect, buried beneath the pressure to solve a shocking murder. But it was still there, waiting for technology, waiting for investigators willing to question the past, waiting for someone to look at the case without assuming the original investigators had been right. Eventually that happened, and when it did, Rachel's murder could finally be understood in a different light. The young mother who walked onto Wimbledon Common in 1992 had not simply become another cold case statistic. Her death had exposed weaknesses in the criminal justice system. Her case had shown the consequences of tunnel vision. Her investigation had demonstrated the danger of confusing suspicion with evidence. And her family's decades-long wait had shown the human cost of those mistakes. The final answer did not arrive with a dramatic confession. It came through science, through preserved evidence, through forensic work, through investigators willing to reopen what others had already tried to close. And when the evidence finally pointed to Robert Napper, the central mystery was solved. But the emotional question remained. What had Rachel's life looked like if she had survived that morning? What would her son have remembered? What would her family have celebrated with her? Those questions can never be answered. A conviction can establish who was responsible. It cannot restore what was taken. That is why the case remains so powerful. Because beneath the investigation, beneath the police failures, beneath the courtroom controversy, there was a person, Rachel Nichol, 23 years old, a mother, a daughter, a woman who should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, Her life became the center of one of Britain's most painful murder investigations. And the longer the investigation lasted, the clearer the lesson became. The truth cannot be forced into a theory. Evidence must be allowed to challenge the theory. A suspect must not become the answer simply because investigators have invested years in pursuing him. And when the evidence points somewhere else, investigators must be prepared to follow it. In Rachel's case, the evidence eventually led away from Colin Stagg. It led toward Robert Napper. And that change in direction was not a minor correction. It was the difference between accusing an innocent man and identifying the person responsible for a young mother's death. The case was eventually solved. But the path to that solution became a warning that would outlive the investigation itself. A warning about certainty. A warning about assumptions. A warning about the pressure to close a case. And a warning about what can happen when investigators stop asking the most important question. What if we are wrong? For Rachel's family, that question came far too late. But eventually, the evidence answered another one. Who killed Rachel Nichol? Robert Napper. And after years of uncertainty, that name finally replaced the wrong name that had dominated the investigation. The truth had arrived, but Rachel could not. Her family could not turn back the clock. Her son could not become a child again, and the years lost to investigative failure could never be recovered. All that remained was the truth, a truth written into forensic evidence, a truth established in court. A truth that finally gave Rachel's family what they had been waiting for. An answer, not a perfect ending, not a happy ending, just the truth. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the truth is the only thing left that can still speak for the victim. The murder of Rachel Nichol did not end when the police identified Robert Napper. In some ways, that was when another chapter began. Because once the real killer had been identified, the failures of the original investigation could no longer remain hidden behind the uncertainty of an unsolved murder. The evidence had finally provided an answer, but it also raised a painful question. How had investigators spent so much time looking at the wrong man? Colin Stagg had been the center of the investigation. He had been watched. He had been questioned. He had been arrested. He had been prosecuted. And yet, he had not killed Rachel. The later forensic evidence made that clear. The consequences of the mistake were enormous. For Stagg, the accusation had become part of his life. For Rachel's family, the investigation had created years of uncertainty. For British policing, the case became a warning about what happens when investigators become too committed to one theory. The story began with a murder that shocked the country. Rachel was 23. She was walking on Wimbledon Common with her 2-year-old son and her dog. The attack was sudden and brutal. Rachel was killed. Her son survived. The public demanded answers. Police officers faced enormous pressure. The investigation needed a suspect. And eventually, attention turned toward Stagg. The reasons for that suspicion were not based on a single piece of physical evidence. They involved impressions about his personality, his interests, and his behavior. Investigators believed those details were significant, but none of them could establish that Stagg had killed Rachel. That gap between suspicion and proof became the central problem. Instead of closing the gap through physical evidence, investigators attempted another strategy. They created the undercover operation. A female officer presented herself as Lizzie James. She established contact with Stagg. She developed a relationship with him. She encouraged him to discuss disturbing subjects. The police hoped that his behavior would eventually reveal guilt, but the operation produced no confession to Rachel's murder. It produced conversations. It produced disturbing material. It produced impressions. But it did not produce proof that Stagg had committed the killing. When the case reached court, the prosecution's position became increasingly difficult to maintain. The evidence obtained through the undercover operation was challenged. The judge rejected it. Without that material, the prosecution's case was unable to continue. Stagg was freed. The investigation had failed. And somewhere beyond the courtroom, Rachel's real killer remained at large. That reality is important, because while the police were focused on Stagg, Rachel's family was still living with the consequences of the murder. Her son was growing up. Every year without an answer meant another year without closure. The family could not simply accept that the case had gone wrong. They had lost Rachel. They wanted to know who had killed her. They wanted to know why. And they wanted the police investigation to succeed. Instead, they watched the case become increasingly controversial. The public debate moved away from the murder itself. The focus turned toward Stagg, then toward the undercover operation, then toward the police. Rachel risked becoming buried beneath the controversy surrounding the investigation, but the central fact never changed. She was the victim. Everything else came afterward. The case eventually became one of the most frequently discussed examples of investigative tunnel vision in Britain. Tunnel vision does not require bad intentions. An investigator can genuinely believe they are doing the right thing. They can believe a suspect is dangerous. They can believe they are close to solving the case. They can believe every new detail supports their theory. That is precisely what makes tunnel vision so dangerous. The investigator may not realize it is happening. Once a suspect becomes the center of the investigation, alternative explanations can begin to disappear. Questions become narrower. Evidence is interpreted through the existing theory. And the investigation can stop testing whether the theory is correct. Instead, it begins searching for ways to prove it. The Rachel Nichol case became a stark example. Stagg's behavior was treated as important. His personality was treated as important. His conversations were treated as important. But the physical evidence did not establish his guilt. Years later, DNA would provide the answer that the original investigation had failed to find. The DNA connected Robert Napper to Rachel. That scientific evidence changed the entire narrative. Napper had not been the focus of the original investigation, but once the forensic evidence pointed toward him, detectives could no longer ignore the possibility that the original theory had been completely wrong. They began examining his background. They discovered a history of serious violence. They examined previous incidents involving women. They looked at what was known about him, and the picture became increasingly disturbing. Napper was not simply a random name produced by a database. He had a history that demanded attention. The DNA connection provided the bridge. The original investigation had searched for a suspect. The later investigation had evidence. That distinction became one of the defining lessons of the case. The identification of Napper eventually led to his conviction. For Rachel's family, there was finally a legal answer, but the emotional damage remained. No verdict could restore Rachel. No conviction could give her son the childhood he should have had. No apology could return the years lost while the investigation pursued the wrong man. And no legal ruling could erase the public association between Stagg and a murder he did not commit. The case therefore became a story about two different forms of injustice. The first was the murder itself. The second was the failure of the investigation. Rachel had been murdered. Stagg had been wrongly prosecuted. The real killer had remained free. Those facts existed at the same time, and they were connected by one investigative failure. The police had believed they had found the answer. They had not. That realization led to scrutiny of police methods. The undercover operation became a major focus. The use of deception in an investigation can be legitimate in some circumstances. But the Rachel Nichol case showed the dangers when such tactics are used to reinforce a theory that lacks strong independent evidence. The officer playing Lizzie James was attempting to obtain information from Stagg. The operation went on for months. Stagg was encouraged to discuss sexual and violent fantasies. The conversations became increasingly disturbing, but the question remained. Did those conversations prove that he had murdered Rachel? No. And the court's decision reflected that distinction. A person's fantasies are not proof of murder. A strange personality is not proof of murder. A disturbing conversation is not proof of murder. A successful investigation must connect the suspect to the crime itself. The DNA evidence eventually did that for Napper. It did not do it for Stagg. That contrast is perhaps the clearest summary of the investigative failure. The man police had focused on lacked the forensic connection. The man eventually convicted had it. The truth was not hidden in someone's personality. It was hidden in physical evidence. And that evidence survived. That fact gave the case its second life. Years after Rachel's death, investigators could return to evidence collected in 1992. Technology had improved. DNA analysis had become more sensitive. Investigators could examine material in ways that had not been possible during the original investigation. The case could be approached without the assumptions that had shaped the first investigation. That was crucial. A cold case investigator can sometimes have one advantage that the original team did not: distance. There is no immediate pressure, no desperate demand to produce an arrest tomorrow, no assumption that the suspect already sitting in front of you must be responsible. The file can be open again. Every statement can be questioned. Every piece of evidence can be examined. Every old conclusion can be challenged. And that is what happened. The physical evidence eventually pointed toward Napper. The science provided a new direction. The investigation followed it. The result was a conviction. But the case still carried the scars of everything that came before. The story of Colin Stagg became inseparable from Rachel's. That may seem strange. He was not her killer. But the wrongful prosecution became one of the defining elements of the investigation. His experience showed how easily an innocent person can become trapped inside a theory. It also showed why investigators must protect themselves against confirmation bias. When police officers are under pressure, they need answers. But an answer that feels right is not necessarily an answer supported by evidence. The difference can destroy lives. Stagg's life was changed by the accusation. Rachel's family was changed by the murder. And the real killer remained free for years. The investigation eventually corrected itself. But correction came slowly. Too slowly for Rachel. Too slowly for her son. Too slowly for her family. The final identification of Napper could not undo the past. It could only establish the truth. And the truth was painful. The killer had been someone else. The original suspect had been innocent. The investigation had gone wrong. And the consequences had lasted for years. That is why the case remains important. It is not simply a story about forensic science. It is not simply a story about a killer. It is not simply a story about police failure. It is all three. At its center is Rachel. Everything begins with her. A young woman walking with her child. A normal morning. A life that should have continued. Then violence. Then silence. Then decades of investigation. Then finally an answer. The case reminds us that criminal investigations are not abstract exercises. Every mistake has a human cost. Every wrong suspect has a life. Every missed clue represents time. Every year without a solution is another year in which a family waits. The phrase cold case can make a murder sound distant. It is not distant to the people who love the victim. For Rachel's family, the case was never cold. It remained alive every day. Her name remained alive. Her absence remained alive. The unanswered questions remained alive. And when the investigation eventually found the real killer, the family received something they had been denied for years: certainty. Not happiness. Not restoration. Certainty. They finally knew who had been responsible. That mattered. But it did not erase the pain. Rachel was still gone. Her son still grew up without her. The years still existed. And the investigation's failures remained part of the historical record. The case therefore leaves behind a difficult lesson. Solving a crime is not enough. Investigators must solve it correctly. They must identify the right person. They must protect the innocent. They must preserve evidence. They must challenge their assumptions. And they must never allow the desire for closure to become more important than the truth. Rachel's murder showed what happens when those principles are forgotten. The original investigation became trapped around one suspect. The prosecution collapsed. The real killer remained free. Then science reopened the case. DNA provided what suspicion could not. It gave investigators a direction based on evidence. That direction led to Robert Napper. And eventually, the legal system established his responsibility for Rachel's murder. The case was finally solved. But the story of the investigation did not end with a verdict, because the most important lesson was not simply that DNA can solve old crimes. It was that evidence must remain stronger than belief. Belief can change. Theories can collapse. Investigators can be wrong. But physical evidence, when properly preserved and interpreted, can survive all of them. Rachel's case proved that. The evidence survived the failed prosecution. It survived the years. It survived the changing technology. It survived the collapse of the original theory. And eventually it spoke. It said that Colin Stagg was not the man responsible. It pointed toward Robert Napper. And after years of uncertainty, that difference finally mattered. Because Rachel deserved the truth. Her son deserved the truth. Her family deserved the truth. And even an investigation that had gone badly wrong could still, eventually, find its way back to the evidence. The road there had been painfully long, but the evidence had waited. And when investigators finally listened, the silence surrounding Rachel's murder began to break. The silence surrounding Rachel's murder had lasted for years, but silence did not mean the case had disappeared. The files remained. The evidence remained. Rachel's name remained. And somewhere inside those records was the difference between a theory and the truth. That difference had already cost years. It had cost Colin Stagg his freedom and reputation. It had cost Rachel's family time they could never recover. And it had allowed the real killer to remain outside a courtroom for far too long. When investigators eventually turned their attention toward Robert Napper, they were no longer working from the assumptions that had shaped the original investigation. They had something stronger. DNA. That evidence became the bridge between the past and the present. It connected a crime committed in 1992 with a man whose identity had remained outside the center of the original investigation. The importance of that discovery cannot be overstated. For years, the case had been driven by human interpretation. Now it was being driven by forensic evidence. The difference was fundamental. Investigators could disagree about a person's personality. They could disagree about whether someone's behavior appeared suspicious. They could debate what a conversation meant. But DNA evidence provided something different. It created a scientific link, and that link pointed toward Napper. The investigation then had to examine what that discovery meant. Who was Robert Napper? What was already known about him? Had police encountered him before? Were there earlier warning signs? Could his history have led investigators toward him sooner? Those questions became unavoidable. Napper had a documented history of violence. He had previously come to the attention of authorities. He had been involved in serious offenses. The more investigators learned, the more disturbing the picture became. But even with that history, the most important evidence remained the DNA. Without that forensic connection, investigators would still have needed to establish his responsibility for Rachel's murder through admissible evidence. The DNA provided a foundation, and that foundation changed the direction of the case. The investigation that had once focused so heavily on Stagg could now be reassessed. Every earlier assumption could be questioned. Every decision could be examined. Every missed possibility could be reconsidered. And the consequences of the original investigation became clearer. The police had not simply failed to identify the killer immediately. They had pursued someone else. That meant time had been lost. The real killer had not been brought before a court. Rachel's family had continued to wait, and an innocent man had carried the burden of an accusation. This was not a minor error. It was a chain of consequences. The first link was suspicion. The second was a decision to pursue that suspicion. The third was the attempt to build a case around it. The fourth was a failed prosecution. And only much later did forensic science break the chain. The case demonstrated how quickly an investigation can become trapped once a suspect begins to dominate the thinking. Investigators are trained to search for patterns. Patterns can be useful. They can reveal connections. They can help detectives understand complicated crimes. But patterns can also deceive. A person's behavior can look meaningful even when it has nothing to do with the crime. A strange comment can seem important. A coincidence can look like evidence. A suspicious lifestyle can become a substitute for proof. That was one of the central failures exposed by the Rachel Nichol investigation. The case against Stagg was not ultimately sustained by physical evidence. The undercover operation became central, and once the court rejected that evidence, the prosecution collapsed. The investigation had to confront a reality it had been resisting. There was no sufficient case against Stagg. The man they had pursued was not the murderer. The real killer was still somewhere else. For Rachel's family, that must have been devastating. They had already suffered the unimaginable. Now, they had to watch the investigation fail. The person accused of killing Rachel was released. The murder remained unresolved. The family had to continue living with uncertainty, and the public had to continue living with the knowledge that the killer had not been found. Years passed. Rachel's son grew older. The case became part of his childhood. A murder he could not remember clearly became an event that shaped his life. He would learn about his mother through photographs, through family stories, through the records of the investigation, through the media attention that surrounded the case. That is one of the cruelest consequences of murder. The victim's life becomes something other people must reconstruct. The child left behind cannot ask the victim questions. There is no opportunity to recover memories that were never made. The investigation may eventually identify a killer, but it cannot reconstruct a childhood. That was the human cause behind the headlines. While the police files grew, Rachel's son was growing too. The case was no longer simply an investigation. It was part of family history. And then the forensic breakthrough changed the meaning of the entire story. DNA had connected Napa to Rachel. The evidence gave investigators a route they had not followed before. The case could finally move toward the person responsible. Napa was eventually prosecuted. The evidence was presented, and the legal process established his responsibility. For Rachel's family, the conviction finally answered the central question: who killed her? They knew. But the answer came with another realization. The truth had not been found through the original theory. It had been found after the original theory failed. That distinction mattered. It demonstrated why cold case investigations sometimes succeed where earlier investigations failed. A cold case team can approach the evidence differently. They can ask questions without being tied to old assumptions. They can use technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. They can examine evidence with a fresh perspective, and they can challenge decisions that once seemed unquestionable. Rachel's case benefited from those possibilities. The science was different. The investigators were different. The context was different. But the evidence was still there. That is what gave the case a second chance. The phrase cold case often suggests that a case has gone cold because there are no clues. That is not always true. Sometimes the clues are there. They simply have not been interpreted correctly. Sometimes the evidence exists, but the technology is not ready. Sometimes investigators are looking at the wrong suspect. Sometimes the answer is hidden behind an assumption. Rachel's case contained elements of all of those problems. The evidence existed. Technology improved. The original suspect was wrong. And eventually, investigators returned to the physical evidence. The result was a completely different story. The person once suspected was not responsible. The person eventually identified was. That reversal became one of the most striking elements of the case. It also created a painful legacy for Stagg. Being clear does not necessarily restore a person's life to what was before an accusation. An arrest changes how people see you. A prosecution creates records. Newspaper coverage lasts. Names remain searchable. The memory of an accusation can survive long after the accusation has been disproved. For Stagg, the consequences lasted years. He became an example of how investigative error can affect someone who is not a victim of the original crime. That does not diminish Rachel's suffering. It demonstrates the scale of the failure. One investigation created damage in multiple directions. Rachel lost her life. Her family lost her. Her son lost his mother. Stagg lost years under suspicion. And the real killer remained free. The eventual conviction could not reverse those consequences. It could only stop the uncertainty from continuing. And that is why the resolution of the case mattered. The truth had to be established. Not because a conviction could repair everything. It could not. But because without the truth, Rachel's murder will remain surrounded by unanswered questions. The evidence gave those questions answers. The forensic connection pointed toward Napper. His history was examined. The case was reconstructed. The prosecution proceeded. And the court ultimately recognized his responsibility. The legal conclusion was important, but the investigation's lessons were equally important. Police needed to understand how the original case had become so focused on Stagg. They needed to examine the role of psychological profiling. They needed to examine the undercover operation. They needed to understand how investigators had interpreted Stagg's behavior. And they needed to understand why the physical evidence had not been given enough weight to prevent the wrong direction. These questions became part of the case's legacy. The investigation demonstrated that profiling can never replace evidence. A psychological profile may help generate leads. It cannot prove identity. A suspect may fit a profile and still be innocent. Another person may not fit the expected profile and still be the killer. The evidence must decide. That principle became painfully clear. Napa was not identified because detectives eventually decided he looked like the murderer. He was identified because forensic evidence connected him to the crime. That is the difference between suspicion and proof. It is also the difference between an investigation that feels convincing and an investigation that can survive a courtroom. Rachel's case eventually reached that standard, but only after years of failure. Only after an innocent man had been prosecuted. Only after the original theory had collapsed. Only after technology provided a new path. That sequence matters, because it demonstrates how fragile justice can become when investigators stop challenging their own assumptions. The police were not simply dealing with a murder. They were dealing with pressure. The public wanted answers. The media wanted answers. Rachel's family wanted answers. Every day without an arrest increased the pressure. And when Stagg became a suspect, the possibility of closure became real. An arrest can create the appearance of progress. But an arrest is not a solution. A charge is not proof. A suspect is not a killer. Those distinctions are basic. Yet the Rachel Nichol case showed how difficult they can become under enormous public pressure. The prosecution collapsed. The wrong suspect was released. And the case entered a new period of uncertainty. The real breakthrough came much later. DNA. A scientific method capable of connecting evidence to a person. A method that did not depend on whether detectives believed the suspect was strange. A method that did not care about psychological theories. A method that could challenge the assumptions of the past. That is why the DNA evidence became so important. It was not merely another clue. It was a correction. It told investigators that their previous direction had been wrong. And once they accepted that, the case could finally move. Robert Napper became the focus. The evidence was followed. The investigation developed. And eventually, the courtroom delivered its conclusion. Rachel's murderer had been identified. The decades of uncertainty had finally ended. But the story still carried a shadow. Because the question was no longer only, who killed Rachel? It was also, why did it take so long? The answer was uncomfortable. Because the investigation had become trapped. It had trusted a theory. It had invested in that theory. It had pursued an innocent man. And only later had science forced the investigation to look elsewhere. That is a lesson that remained after the headlines disappeared. A murder investigation must remain open to being wrong. It must be willing to question itself. It must allow evidence to destroy a theory. And it must remember that every suspect is a human being. Rachel deserved justice. Stagg deserved not to be wrongly accused. And the public deserved an investigation based on evidence rather than assumption. The eventual resolution did not erase the failure. It exposed it. The DNA breakthrough proved that a different path had always been possible. The evidence had survived. And eventually, investigators found it. The truth had waited longer than anyone should have been forced to wait. But it waited. And when the evidence was finally allowed to speak, the name it gave investigators was not Colin Stagg. It was Robert Napper. That single distinction changed the history of the case. It separated an innocent man from a terrible crime. It gave Rachel's family an answer. And it showed why cold cases should never be considered hopeless simply because years have passed. Time can destroy memories. But time cannot always destroy evidence. Sometimes evidence survives long enough for technology to catch up. Sometimes a case can remain silent for decades and then suddenly speak again. Rachel's case did exactly that. And when it finally spoke, it forced investigators to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all. They had been wrong. The wrong man had been pursued. The real killer had been somewhere else. And the evidence had been waiting for someone to look at the case without the assumptions that had shaped it from the beginning. For Rachel's family, that answer came too late. But it came, and after years of silence, the truth finally had a name.